disappears. I think that was the only group that's done anything outside on the grounds of the Fairbanks house. And the person who was doing it is of Native descent. And so I wonder if you know, if
responding to her specifically.
Well, yeah. I mean, because honestly, I would understand that if they are native spirits, I wouldn't want to talk to colonizers. I mean,
like, all these white people wandering around, probably waiting for a Native American to interact with, rather than
Yeah, no, that makes total sense. Who do you guys think the spirits in the house are? Do you have names for them?
Yeah, we have a pretty good idea. So the main spirit, the sort of matronly protective one, is likely, we think, Rebecca, that last tenant.
I'm almost positive.
Yeah, we're pretty sure it's Rebecca. I don't want to assume anything, but we're pretty sure it's Rebecca.
Well, just aside from the way the spirit behaves, we also know Rebecca did not want to leave. Yeah. In 1904, so before that, she had money troubles. And because, again, that the last century of people living in the house had struggled. And Rebecca did not want to leave. And basically, so funds were raised to keep the house. And she was told, you can keep living here as long as you give tours to anyone who shows up. So this poor woman is in her 80s. This is her house she's lived in for decades. And suddenly she has to show it to people, So anyway, I mean, she's said there's so many great stories about Rebecca. We could do a whole thing about her. But she was not a fan of that. And it was funny because the family would take out like ads in the local paper apologizing for how rude Rebecca was. Basically like, we're sorry about that.
Yeah, at least twice they did. Yeah.
But starting in 1902, the family was like, oh, Rebecca, isn't it time for you to, why don't you go move in with your sister? And, it'll be much more comfortable for you. And she's like, nope. She would not leave until in 1904, her dog died. And this hound was her beloved companion. You can't find a picture of her without the dog. And that's when she finally said, okay. And so the only reason she finally agreed to leave was because her loyal companion wasn't there anymore. The family had started legal eviction proceedings to try to get her out by that point.
Oh my goodness.
Because they kept trying and she wouldn't leave. So she did not want to leave. She passed away in 1908. And I think she came right back.
Yeah, we're pretty sure she
didn't want to
right
leave. Yeah. We know she didn't want to leave in life. Why would she have left in death?
So yeah, we were pretty sure Rebecca's the sort of the main entity. Well, another thing that supports that is, so I mentioned cold spots. The most common form of cold spot in the house is roughly knee height brushing up against people's legs.
And there is an EVP of a dog whining.
Yeah, and there's an EVP of the dog whining. So yeah, she's not alone. It's her and her dog are both there together watching over the house.
And that was actually, after the alarm stuff, that was my first experience personally in the house, was a cold spot. And it was one of those, it felt like my hand had been dipped in ice water. It was so dramatic. And we were nowhere near anywhere there could have been a draft, not to mention the fact that it was mid-August. So it was incredibly hot out. And I literally could move my hand in and out of this one spot. And then it faded away and wasn't there anymore. But it was, my hand down at my side, exactly the height of a large hound. So that was my first, personal experience aside from just hearing the alarm going off.
And then the West Wing, we've narrowed it down to, one or two guys. Around 1800, when the family's fortunes are starting to go downhill, you have two Fairbanks that have a pretty rough go of it. Jason Fairbanks and his brother Abner Fairbanks. And so at that point, the house was owned by a guy named Ebenezer Fairbanks Jr., and he's the one who added the East Wing. So it's him and his 8 children and his wife that are the family activity over there in the East Wing.
Oh my goodness.
But the West Wing is his 2 younger brothers, we think, whereas where his 2 younger brothers lived, Jason and Abner. And so Jason is sort of the black sheep of the Fairbanks family. In 1801, he was tried, convicted, and hanged for murdering his girlfriend. There is still debate over whether he actually did it, or if he did do it, was he mentally fit to stand trial or to understand what he had done. He had a lot of, to make it a very long story short, he had a lot of issues. He had a lot of problems, many of them not in any way his or the family's fault, but he definitely had those issues. And a young woman did die while he was the only one in the area, as far as anyone knows. So anyway, and I know Allison's been researching Jason a lot, and I can see she really wants to interject here.
I'm not gonna say much just because, we don't have several hours for me to give my entire, but I've been researching this and he allegedly murdered his girlfriend Elizabeth Fales, but he was hanged for it, and it was a huge event in Dedham. The Jason Fairbanks murder trial was the O.J. Simpson trial of the early 1800s. I mean, this was national news. This was crazy. Yeah. He was broken out of prison, and there was a nationwide manhunt. I mean, it's a very dramatic tale. Well, but so clearly he had a rough go of it at the end.
Yeah, he had a rough go of it. And actually, to give you one thing to note that really puts this in perspective, at the time of his hanging, 2,000 people lived in Dedham. 10,000 people showed up to watch Jason's hanging.
Oh, wow.
It's the best attended event in Dedham history to that point.
Oh, my goodness.
And actually, since there's no major performance venues in Dedham, it might still be the best attended event in Dedham history. I was just going to say that.
Yeah. I was going to say, outside of their Flag Day celebrations.
Right. That might be the best turnout they've ever had. So anyway, he had a very rough life that was made very public. But his brother had a very rough life that was made very, very private. Abner was 4 years older than Jason. I can tell you that his name is Abner. I can tell you his birth date and his death date, and literally nothing else.
And that is incredibly rare.
Yeah, I mean, because the family, people had records.
Because the house was always owned by the Fairbanks family, we have great records. And there were local physicians in town who kept detailed records. And I mean, literally, we know so much about every Fairbanks who lived in the house except Abner.
Yeah. And so the feeling is... this is sort of where, like, the paranormal and, history and medical history and all the weird stuff sort of come together, which as a historian, that's the part I always look for. So Abner was definitely an interesting aspect of the Fairbanks family for me. We think what happened, again, this is all, it's an educated guess, but speculation. Educated speculation. That it looked like Abner had some sort of severe illness that in early 1800s with little or no medical knowledge would have looked something like possession.
Epilepsy or some sort of
epilepsy or any kind of movement disorder, anything like that. If you don't know how human physiology works or germ theory or any of that, it's pretty easy to come to the possession conclusion. And so based on a few different things, we think that may have been what happened to Abner.
Well, I think it's worth saying, so some of the reasons that we think this, and this kind of, again, connects with the paranormal aspect, is that, so hex marks are something that are, very common in first period houses. And the Fairbanks house has one of the largest and most varied collection of hex marks of any first period house in this area or in the country.
In anywhere in the country. Yeah, there's a lot of them.
So clearly, and many of them we can date to the late 1700s.
And just for our listeners who might not know what hex marks are, could you guys just explain them really quick?
So a hex mark is, the most common forms are either a cross or a circle or what are called daisy wheels or pinwheels are very common. But the thought was that a hex mark did for your house spiritually what windows and doors do for it physically. They were wards or protective. The technical term is apotropaic markings. That's kind of a mouthful. So anyway, hex marks are ways of protecting your house from evil spirits, witches, demons, all this stuff that in the 1600s, when the house was really built, people full on believed these were real things. The devil is real and he actively wants you, to go to turn evil. And he is going to do everything in his power, and his minions are going to do everything in their power to turn you or hurt you in some way. So anyway, the hex marks from the 1600s were for that.
And of course, hex marks in general, there's a whole other, 3-hour-long talk we could give on the weird intersection of the religious intolerance of Puritans and their use of folk magic, but that's a whole other thing.
On the surface, Puritans were very against this. Under the surface, almost every Puritan household had some hex mark somewhere.
So, I mean, these hex marks are all over the house, but there is a crazy concentration of them in the West Wing. Yeah. And again, just based on who was living in the house at the time, the teenage / young 20-something males would have been the most likely to have had their bedrooms be in the West Wing at this time. And that would be Jason and Abner. And another thing, so aside from the large variety of hex marks, there's the nail in the floor.
So the nails throughout the house are iron, all of them, except one. There is one brass nail driven into the middle of the floor in the hallway of the West Wing. It's the only brass nail in the entire house. So I saw that and I was like, that's got to be something. So I looked and I dug, and after a lot of effort, I found out that it was something similar to the hex marks, in that they thought that a nail did the same thing spiritually that it does physically, holds things in place. So if you have a family member who has a fit or seizure or whatever you want to call it, what you do is you wait for them to collapse and you watch where their head hits the floor. And then you drive a nail preferably a brass nail, into the floor where their head connected. And that will pin the seizure or fit or epilepsy or whatever it is to the ground, hopefully curing them. Mm-hmm. And this was part of the same belief structure that created hex marks and all these other kind of folk magics.
So you've got that. And then possibly the most dramatic is that the West Wing is also the only place in the house where there is evidence of locks on the outside of the doors.
Yeah.
As in someone or something being locked in their room.
Yeah, so a bedroom with a lock on the outside of the door is suspicious no matter what time period,
oh, absolutely.
Yeah, and what else is going on. So something bad was happening
again,
with somebody.
It could be, of course, a lot of the things we're talking about with Abner could also have been one of Abner's aunts who, it said died of a palsy, which back then meant literally died of any sort of movement disorder they couldn't describe otherwise.
Yeah.
So we don't know for sure it's him, but there's definitely little enough information about him and enough information about something weird going on in the house at that time to draw some conclusions.
Yeah.
Jason, the idea that it might be him is pretty much just because of the whole star-crossed lovers, love cut short thing. Because even before, when he and Elizabeth first got together, her parents didn't approve of him and all this and that. So there's a very dramatic story. But according to the family and the records, no one knew of anything really wrong with him, at least mentally. Physically, he had some issues. But there's nothing in the house to suggest that anyone was worried about Jason, pretty much. So it's in terms of who had a more dramatic, mysterious past, that would probably be Abner. But in terms of who died the most dramatically, that would be Jason. Mm-hmm. So that's why we're pulled to them.
Yeah, so it could be either of them or both of them that's in the West Wing.
And we do know that someone in the West Wing really likes weddings. People will sometimes rent out the fields at the Fairbanks house for a wedding reception, at least to have photos taken, because, it's beautiful. So on one occasion, a couple of people were standing outside the house, staff members, and they were watching, these people having pictures taken, and they see one of the curtains in the West Wing move aside as if someone's peering out. Another time, there was a wedding, and a volunteer, was going around closing all the shades for the day, and they went to close this same window in the West Wing, looking out over the field. The voice says, "Leave it open."
Man's voice specifically said, "Leave them open."
So they did. But so that's another reason why that might suggest Jason, just because part of his and Elizabeth's story is that he wanted to run away and elope with her because her parents didn't approve of him. And there's a question of, did she refuse him and he murdered her, or did she try to go away with him and something else happened? And so there's a lot of, but that would suggest Jason also.
Yeah.
Interesting. Very interesting.
So it's interesting when you kind of cross the history and the paranormal aspects, and sort of in the history field, you're not allowed to use spectral evidence.
Yeah.
But you can use history evidence in the ghost hunting field. So,
for sure.
In fact, you should. So, but it's interesting to kind of, because we know so much about who lived in that house, we can do this more than a lot of haunted places where we can actually, a lot of places like, oh, there's a ghost. People see a lady in a dress. Okay, well, there's a lot of different ladies in dresses, but like at least at the Fairbanks house, there's ways to narrow it down more specifically than in most places, which I think makes it even more interesting to me.
Well, and because like we said, the main part of the house was built in 1637, but the fact that other parts of the house were built at different times means that we can get very specific about who lived where when. Yeah. Because we know for a fact that the last men to live in the house were that generation. So basically the West Wing hadn't been built that long before the Jason and Abner generation. And after that generation, the family's fortunes go way downhill, partly because Ebenezer Jr., who's Jason and Abner's brother, didn't make great money decisions, but mostly because of the murder trial of Jason, the family reputation goes down the toilet and they can't, no one will sell them or anything. So after that, it's only unmarried women who live in the house until 1904. So we know that there aren't any later guys in the West Wing. So it's nice because we can pinpoint things like that.
So we get a male presence in the West Wing. It can only be so many people. Yeah.
That's fascinating.